This isn't, actually, this is the public hearing for the budget, and Superintendent Neal would like to make some prefacing comments before we hear from Larry Oberst.
Dr. Baker and members, I would like to just share a little bit about what we've done over the past 20 years with all of the cuts from losing 8,000 students, closing 35 schools, cutting 1,000 positions, eliminating $100 million out of our budget. We have done the right thing. We've done a great job with the resources that we have. We said that we would create stability and stop the churn, and that's exactly what we've done in the district. And so we are pleased to say that we've had the best count day that we've had in 20 years. And moving forward, we would like for the public to know that the district, the students, are in great hands. We're pleased to serve. WalletHub.com recently ranked us as the second most efficient school district in the nation, and so we're really pleased about that. And so even though as we go through to discuss our budget during this hearing, I would like for you all to know that we are in great hands right now in the district, and pleased to share all the wonderful programs. Thank you.
Go for it, Larry.
Perfect. Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2015-16 budget public hearing. There's a presentation behind me that some points that I'll talk from, and certainly if anybody has any questions at the end of the presentation, feel free to ask those questions. We're about 2 weeks left before our fiscal year 15 winds down, and it'll be a few months after that before we find out for sure where we stand at the end of fiscal year 15. As we prepared to do the budget for fiscal year 15-16, we knew by virtue of the fact that the current year we're in, we had to delve into our fund balance. And the board has a policy that the fund balance needs to be at or above 5% of 1 year's estimated budgeted expenditures in the general fund. And so that was our guiding light as we looked at 2015-16. We knew we had challenges funding from the state. We knew we had to make some additional adjustments to our budget. We were able to grant compensation increases during the current year to all employee groups. For our bargaining groups, they were statutorily required, or actually contractually required, by virtue of enrollment incentives. And we had as the superintendent just mentioned, a great count day in the current year we're in. So all those challenges in place, we got to it. And let me just talk first on some of the revenue assumptions that are embedded in this 15-16 budget. First of all, the state, the majority of our funding comes from the state, as you're well aware, by virtue of this foundation allowance. For 15-16, the state of Michigan increased our foundation allowance by $140 per pupil up to a total of $7,391 per pupil. Those total dollars equate to $2.4 million. So $2.4 million increase in our foundation allowance for 15-16. However, bullet point 2, there were a couple of categoricals that had been really embedded in the foundation allowance for the last couple of years. They took those away. The best practices and the pupil performance funding, those totaled in the current year $120. They took those away from us, did not replace that funding. So up $140 from the foundation allowance, down $120 from the elimination of best practices and performance funding. So our net foundation allowance, year-over-year increase, was only $20 per pupil. And that totals only $338,000 in new money. The foundation allowance are unrestricted funds. We can spend those as we deem appropriate, but $338,000 on an almost $200 million budget doesn't go very far for our fiscal year 15-16. However, we did get some relief by virtue of the at-risk dollars. The state legislature appropriated an additional $70 million in at-risk dollars. Those are restricted. For the last number of years, they've been used in a general way to reduce class size. The year we're in currently, 2014-15, they relaxed some of those restrictions to allow us to use those dollars for two purposes. One, third grade reading literacy, and secondly, for 11th grade career and college readiness. So those new at-risk dollars equate to approximately $104 per student for 15-16. That's a total increase of $1.76 million. So in total, from the $338,000 increase in the foundation allowance, the plus 1.76 increase in restricted 31A dollars, total new money for fiscal year 15-16 from the state is about $2.1 million. Again, $338,000 of it is unrestricted. $1.76 million of it has some restrictions attached to it. On the expense side, based on the current year we're in, where we had to delve into fund balance, we knew we had to make some expense rationalizations for fiscal year 15-16. We knew we had a compensation adjustment, as I just mentioned, that we granted to all our employee groups last year. Part of that hit in the current year. Part of it will hit in the 15-16 year. That additional amount is around $2 million. So we knew there would be an additional $2 million in compensation expense, all other things being equal. There's other normal cost increases that you can expect. We had some increases in our vision and dental plans at the district office to employees. General inflationary increases. As you're maybe aware, we're starting a museum school with a grade this year. We've expanded our Frost School, and some additional costs, people costs associated with those new programs and new expansions. So with those cost increases and the need to have our fund balance be at a 5% or above level, we did have to make some budget reductions after our first go-around with the 15-16 budget. Most of those reductions were made outside the classroom. We looked there first. We took about $3.2 million out of the central office, both in staff reduction or people reduction, and that's primarily open positions that we are not going to fill. A lot of it came out of non-people areas in terms of supplies and travel and professional development, those kinds of things. We had been on a program over the last couple of years in, re-engineering really our special education services. Earlier this year, the board approved moving our special ed preschoolers, if you will, out of Ken O'Shea campus into the neighborhood schools. And we're making some other changes in the way we deliver those special education services. So we're able to cut a couple $1 million out of our special education costs. And then we also looked back at our classrooms, and based on some vacancies we had in the teaching area and the ability to, for instance, redo some secondary schedules that where we had some classes that had really small enrollments, 10, 12 kids in particular classes that really don't work from a financial perspective, that we think we can take some teaching staff, reduce some teaching staff in that area too. So all told, we took about 46 FTEs out of the district, including about 12 or 13 out of the central office. All but 6 of those were from positions that were already open that we are not going to fill. So we did a great job, I think, in getting to where we needed to get when it was all said and done, with as least impact as we could on the classroom. So those expense reductions were made to get to, show up the next page here, Rhonda. Here is what the 2015-16 general fund budget looks like. The first column is where we ended up in last year, 2013-14. The middle column is where we anticipate being when 2014-15 winds up. At the end of this month, the board, in a work session just prior to this meeting, approved an amendment to So the middle column there, the 2014-15, reflects the Amendment 2 that was just adopted by the board. Then the far right column is a proposed budget for 15-16. The first page here is the revenue side. So we're looking at about $197 million in revenue for the general fund for 15-16. We add that to our fund balance. We expect to end up with this year about $8.5 million. So we have about $205 million that we can appropriate in 15-16. The last line there I just want to point out is the enrollment. A lot has been talked about, and the superintendent mentioned in her opening comments, the last number of years we've seen a significant decrease in enrollments. In fiscal year 13-14, last year, we had anticipated losing, and for budgeting purposes, we had budgeted a loss of 400 students. As you can see, we ended up 13-14 with 16,945. The unaudited blended count for the year we're in right now shows us being at 16,898. That's a loss of not 400 students, but 47 students. So significant, I guess, turn the corner, hopefully, in terms of stabilizing enrollment. The enrollment number we've used in our 15-16 budget is 16,884. That's a 14 student reduction from where I think we'll end up in 14-15. So that's our projection. We've got some positives to that with the new schools I mentioned, the museum and the Frost expansion. There's always some losses in terms of demographics and migrations, people moving out. So we never really know where our enrollment's going to stand until we get school opens next fall and we get into it in a couple of weeks, and then the first count date in October. But we're hoping we've been able to stabilize that enrollment, and in fact, we have minimal loss and maybe even some gains in 15-16. The next slide then is the expenditure side. As I just mentioned, there's $205 million we have for appropriations. We have to keep 5% of that in our fund balance, minimum 5% fund balance. So this is what it looks like on the expenditure side. Again, the first two columns are the last 2 years, 13-14 actual numbers, 14-15 where we think we're going to end up this year. The 15-16, so you can see about $101 million on the instructional side, support services $92 million, community services about $1.5 million, a few other things in there. Total appropriations that we've budgeted, we're proposing to budget for 15-16 is that last number there, $197.5 million approximately. If we hit those budget amounts, if they're approved by the board next week and we hit those in fiscal year 16, this is where our fund balance will be at the end of 16, June of 16 next year. We started the year, this year, with a fund balance of about $19.6 million. That's 13%, as measured by the way the board measures fund balance. We think we're going to end up this year at June 30th, 2015, about $8.5 million. That's 5.3%. As you can see, we delved into our fund balance this year. And then if all goes according to plan, next year, June 30th, we hope to be at around $8 million, $7.9 million. That, again, is about 5.1%. So we're able to stay at that minimum level, and ideally in years subsequent to 16, we can build that fund balance. It's good to be at 5%. It's better to be at 7 or 8 or 9 or 10%. And so as we are able to see additional increases in funding, are able to maybe squeeze some additional costs out of our cost structure, as we see enrollment stabilization hopefully increases with our new programs, new schools, we'll be able to build on that fund balance. I think what's important to know as we look at this fiscal year 16 budget is, with the fund balance being right around that 5%, subsequent years, the minimum we have to have on an annual basis is a balanced budget. Revenues equal expenditures, because we no longer have the flexibility to use our fund balance to fund shortfalls. We made some determinations earlier years to help build that fund balance, which was a good thing. Now with the funding deficiencies the last number of years. We're at the point now where we had to use some of it, and we've used as much as we can. So it's a tight budget. It's a realistic budget. We went line by line as we made the reductions we had to make to get to this essentially. Again, we're not really balanced this year. We have a loss of about $500,000, but it still keeps us within the range we need to be, and going forward it needs to be with essentially a balanced budget. So that was our proposal that we went presented to the board at the work session just previous to this. We're bringing to you as a public tonight. And with that, I will
Larry, I'd like to just add a few things.
Thanks, John. Sure.
I think it's very important to note that, this year on paper was arguably the best year we've had in 20 years, especially when you look at it from an enrollment standpoint, from stability being restored. In so many ways, this budget in the last few years since Superintendent Weatherall Neal was appointed, we've been implementing the transformation plan. In many ways, this budget is reflective of that. We're investing in what's working. That's those investments in the expansion of Frost and the museum school. It looks like investing in our talent. One of the first things we talked about in the budget amendment was committed to reinvesting in our talent, and that's part of what that investment was in this year's budget as well, and it carries over to next year. And the third part is investing for stability and growth. The fact that we have a potential 14 student decline next year is symbolic of stability being restored to the district. Last year was the first year in 2 decades we didn't close a single school. This year was the second year in a row in 2 decades that we didn't close a single school. And next year, we're actually opening a new school that has 200 applications for 60 slots, 100 of which have never had their children in Grand Rapids Public Schools before. And so, we have the structural deficit issues out of Lansing, and these are real, and we've done everything possible as a district to balance this budget, to maintain fund balance. The fact that we're one of few urban districts in this state that actually has a fund balance, that's not under threat of a state takeover, that's symbolic of how well managed things have been in the midst of budget cuts from the state level, our economic recession we weathered through, and declining enrollment. There's a reason why WalletHub.com ranked GRPS the second most efficient school district in the entire country, because we've been able to make these numbers work. But the cautionary tone, as Larry indicated, is we've done virtually everything in the playbook. We wrote the playbook for school districts and how to manage these issues and how to balance a budget amidst all of these different factors. We've exhausted much of that playbook, and now we need to turn to our friends in Lansing, and we need to also be very creative with how we're going to approach, from a Board of Ed, from an administration standpoint, all the budgets, because we're going to have to dive in much deeper, because this structural deficit's not going away anytime soon. But by and large, the message in this is stability, poised for growth.
Yeah. Thank you.
The public can ask questions. It's not a public comment thing. You don't have to fill a card if there's any questions. Larry, so clear and compelling that, there's...
Yeah, again, it's, John, your last few comments there were well taken. It's, on one hand, we've been in this position before, so we know what we had to do to get to where we needed to get. And the other thing is there are structural deficiencies, and just in the last few days, as I mentioned to the board, and many of you are probably aware of this, these local school districts within our ISD that for years and years and years we think of as being well-funded, the Forest Hills, the East Grand Rapids, good quality, well-funded schools are both running deficits this year and are making cuts because they aren't getting the money from Lansing either. We're certainly grateful for what Lansing does, and they certainly got their challenges because there's other agencies need the money also. But we've done a great job of the last 20 years in managing with diminishing resources. So.
I guess we should break and start another meeting in 5 minutes.
Shift in 5 minutes.